It took weeks for the shock of what happened to Preston Jarvis to wear thin enough for Hannah and I to even think about what to do next. We both tried talking to Sarah about it, but the little girl we'd raised seemed to have evaporated that night along with Preston. Her eyes showed no joy, no love, no hope, nothing but emptiness. We attempted a few times to talk to Sarah about the incident, but it was obvious we couldn't get through to her. When we asked her what directly happened to Preston, her answer was always different variations of, "I made him go away." She never said she killed him, and I suppose that wasn't entirely inaccurate, but she also said she couldn't bring him back. I'm not sure whether I believed that she couldn't undo what she'd done. At this point, I wasn't sure if she was incapable of anything, or if it was more that she wouldn't undo what she had done. I'm not sure which option terrified me more. Sarah kept to herself, even more than she had in the past. Before, Hannah and I would always carry conversations with her, get her to join us on trips to the store, but now it was nearly impossible to even get her out of her bedroom for dinner. We would go days without seeing her. We only knew she was alright because we could hear her moving around in her bedroom, and plates of food that Hannah would leave in the hallway would be emptied by morning. I tried to stay up late to see if I could catch Sarah coming out of her bedroom, but I had fallen asleep around 3 a.m., and by the time I'd woken up, the food was gone. Every night the scene replayed over and over in my mind. When I closed my eyes, I could see the tree silhouetted in the dark, felt my heart racing, hear the terrified final screams of the boy who would be wiped from existence in mere seconds. I hated that kid. It was hard to deny any torment and pain he'd caused my family, but I wouldn't have wished that fate on anyone. I tried to tell myself that maybe things were better off this way. Maybe Preston would grow up to be a serial killer or something, but I knew in my heart that that was probably not the case. Sarah had an effect on people that brought out the worst in them. Preston was a terrible kid, but would things have been different had his family not moved down the street from ours? Would he have not acted so maliciously if he hadn't been exposed to Sarah? There was no way to know for sure, but these questions are ones that kept me up at night. That was until the shock had worn off enough for me to finally consider the two questions that I'd been afraid to broach. Was this the first time she's done this? And would she do something like this again? I had a thought cross my mind in the wee hours of the morning after all the raccoons and crickets had gone to sleep. Originally, there had been 3 boys that tormented Sarah. The other 2 had allegedly moved away, but I hadn't seen a moving van. All we had to go by was the account of the bored and nosy neighbors on our street. I spent days thinking about this before I finally decided to find out for myself. If the Francis and Ryan families really had moved, their houses would be empty. If they hadn't, well, I waited until Hannah and Sarah were asleep. I had no intention of telling either of them anything until I had a solid conclusion. As much as I loved Hannah, she wasn't always good at keeping things from Sarah. She didn't have the same focus I did, I suppose. I didn't blame her for that, but it meant I had to be careful with what I told her. Around 3, I got out of bed and slipped on my shoes. The street was illuminated by the street lamps spaced a few houses apart, and the moon above cast an ominous glow around me as I stepped out into the July night. I put my hands in my pocket and began to stroll down the sidewalk. I badly wanted to run, to get there and to be done with the whole business as quickly as possible, but I knew if someone did see me, a man running in the middle of the night seemed more suspicious than someone going on a late night stroll. It must have been only 10 or 15 minutes before I approached the house where Austin Francis had once lived. The yard was mostly dirt with a few patches of grass here and there, all framed by a silver chain link fence that once kept Bear the Rottweiler from terrorizing town. I opened the gate and approached the window. I didn't need to enter the house, just needed to see inside. But unfortunately, the curtains were drawn and all I was able to glimpse was a wall of black. I walked the perimeter of the house and attempted another window. Still, there was nothing to see but darkness. Sighing, I allowed myself one last attempt before I went to the Ryan household. I tried the knob on the back door. It twisted and the door opened with a soft creak that sent my heart pounding. I stepped in and was immediately hit by the acrid scent of decaying meat. I turned on the lights and was unsurprised to find that there was no power. Using the flashlight on my phone, I toured the house. Bowls and plates still sat on the kitchen table. The food they had once held long since dried up, leaving gray and brown remains. Curiously, I opened the fridge, then immediately closed it as the smell struck my face and made my eyes water. I walked the rest of the house, empty bottles of alcohol, and generally the signs of a house that was being lived in, not a house that had been vacated. The scent grew stronger as I approached the bedroom, terrified to see what was on the other side of the door, but knowing I had no other choice if I intended to get answers. I turned the knob and stepped in. It was a boy's bedroom, presumably the bedroom of Austin Francis. Again, I found more indications that nobody had packed anything away. A television, a PlayStation, video games, model cars, things that no boy would leave without. But none of that was what surprised me. What surprised me was the black splatters of dried blood and tissue fragments of bone that covered the walls, spreading from the bed like the boy had gone to bed with a belly full of explosives. Not for the first time since entering the house, I swallowed back hot bile from the pit of my stomach. I closed the bedroom door, thinking then to wipe the fingerprints from the knob, then moved along to the master bedroom where I saw a similar scene. Both Mr. and Mrs. Francis were lying in bed, except their heads had been removed from their bodies and replaced with a similar arc of blood and gray matter painting the pillows, walls, and headboard. After that, I'd seen what I needed and left the house in a haze. Once the door behind me was closed, I lost the battle with my stomach and lurched violently into the overgrown rose bushes. How long had it been since the Francis family allegedly moved? I wasn't sure. It had definitely been over a year, probably closer to 2. I racked my brain as I made my way further down the street towards the Ryan house, trying to remember every detail I could about how the information had traveled to Hannah about the families having moved. She'd been the one who told me both accounts. She had said that she got the information from Tammy Howell, the woman next door who had little better to do than talk on the phone or look out the window. Why would Tammy lie about the Francis family moving? Or had she honestly thought that that's what happened? In a similar fashion to how Preston's own father seemed to honestly think he had never had a son. The Ryan house looked better kept from the outside, although not by much. Weeds had overtaken the lawn and one of the windows had been broken, presumably by a rock thrown from the street. I again attempted to peer through the windows, but after a few fruitless endeavors, I let myself in the backyard to try my luck with the back door. Again, it opened without a problem. The stench that hit my nose was far less potent than the one lingering in the Francis household, but equally as unnerving. Even still, I expected to find the similar signs of abandonment that I had found in the other house. When I flipped on my phone light, I was surprised to see a somewhat clean, empty house. A layer of dust and dirt covered most surfaces, but there was no furniture, no pictures, nothing to indicate that the house was being lived in. It seemed that the house really had been vacated, except for that smell. I followed the smell to a bedroom and opened the door. Again, I had to choke back the urge to evacuate whatever was left in my stomach. My eyes watered as I lifted the light to illuminate the boy's bedroom. This time, instead of the whole room being painted with blood, only half of it was. Laying in the bed were the remains of Kenny Ryan. His left half was particularly intact, his gray skin taut and dry against his skeleton, while his right half was completely missing. It looked as if it had fallen sideways into a wood chipper. Unlike the rest of the house, this room seemed completely untouched. There were no signs of any intentions of packing up Kenny's possessions for the upcoming move. In fact, it seemed as if the family had simply forgotten him. It was with this thought that my heart dropped even further. They really had forgotten about Kenny. He hadn't disappeared like Preston, but he may as well have in the hearts and minds of his family. Is that what Sarah had been trying to do to the Ryan family the year before? There was no way to know for sure. I had no intention of asking her, but that seemed to fit in the morbid sort of way. After spending another few weeks fully processing what I found, I shared my discovery with Hannah. I was a bit nervous to pull her deeper into the problem. She had always struggled with keeping things from Sarah, but I felt like the secret would devour me if I kept it any longer. The start of the school year was fast approaching, and Hannah and I were obsessing over the decision whether or not to allow Sarah to enroll for another year. We were terrified that something else would happen, especially given what I'd found out about the Ryan and Francis families, but we also wanted to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Sarah. And if I'm being honest, Hannah and I needed a break from the constant buzz of danger and unease that followed our daughter, and had now coated every surface of our house. We hadn't yet made our decision, but decided it was best for Sarah to go to orientation at least. We decided I would go with her to see how she did, if anyone came up to her to ask her how summer was, or to find out if there were others like Preston Jarvis on Sarah's shopping block. Nobody approached her, but there was also no bullying either. All things considered, I took it as a win. When we arrived home, Hannah was gone. She left a note telling us she'd gotten a call from the neighbor who needed help with something, and would be back late. This struck me as odd, but I did my best not to think about it just in case Sarah was listening in from her bedroom, which she made a beeline to the moment we arrived home. Later that night, I received a text from Hannah asking if Sarah was asleep. I told her she was, and Hannah walked in the front door, face red and eyes swollen. "Hi," she started and began sobbing. I held her and let her tears soak into my shirt until eventually she calmed down enough to speak. "I'm so scared," she finally whispered. "Scared of what?" I asked, knowing damn well what she was afraid of. "I was afraid too. I found something," Hannah said, pulling away from me. She swallowed, and I could see her throat bob up and down as she searched for the words. When you and Sarah left for orientation, I went through her bedroom. I didn't want to say anything about it because I hated when my parents would go through my room, and I hoped I wouldn't find anything. She paused for a long moment. "What?" I said, filling the silence and searching her eyes for the answer. "What did you find?" She shook her head, unable to speak, then pulled out her phone and handed it to me. On the screen was a picture she'd taken of an old stained shoebox. Inside was a collection of tails from a variety of small animals. Some of them seemed very old and brittle, others fairly fresh with meat and sinew still clinging on from when they were torn off. This pile of tails sat in a nest composed of dozens of blood-stained collars and pet tags. I looked up in shock and disbelief. "I found that in her closet," she said. "Go to the next picture." I swiped to the left and saw an image of an open book. It took me a moment, but I recognized it as a journal Sarah had received from one of her grandmothers last Christmas. Pasted inside the journals were photographs, each with a large X scratched across their faces. I zoomed in and recognized immediately the face of Preston Jarvis. Like in this picture, many of them appeared to have been cut out from the school yearbook. I recognized the face of Sarah's science teacher that had requested she'd be transferred out of class, and another girl I'd seen just a few weeks before hopping along on crutches at the 4th of July parade. I swiped again and saw another page filled with photos. Another swipe, and still more photos. More yearbook images of children, of teachers, family photos of Kenny Ryan and Austin Francis presumably stolen off the walls of their own vacant homes. Pictures of therapists who had mysteriously stopped returning our calls. I looked up at Hannah, my face now completely void of color. We didn't exchange words. We didn't need to, because we both understood at that moment that our daughter had been doing these things for far longer than we knew, and had kept them a secret for just as long. For years, while we thought we were getting through to her, her talents at bay and teaching her right from wrong, Sarah had been killing, torturing, and erasing dozens of people and pets throughout the neighborhood. While I've been so engrossed in explaining what happened all those years ago, things have been going on these past few weeks that have both Hannah and myself even more on edge than we were before. Starting with what happened at the red trailer truck stop. Below is a news article I read this morning. Mr. Gutierrez told police he'd arrived at approximately 5:45 a.m. for his morning shift in the kitchen when he first discovered the body of Emma Fitzgerald by the employee entrance. He noticed an injury on Emma's forehead, which the county coroner determined was likely caused by a fall very near the time of death. All 8 of the other bodies showed signs of trauma similar to what Mr. Gutierrez described, although the coroner report shows that none of the injuries were enough to be fatal. As reported previously, the preliminary investigation reported no signs of violence or theft, nor was there anything indicating signs of gas leaks in the truck stop. Authorities have now completed the final autopsies on the individuals and are now reporting that the deaths did not appear to have been caused by poison or infection. Police and city medical professionals continue to be baffled by this peculiar case, but assure us that there does not appear to be any danger to the community at this time. I can't say for certain when the idea of killing Sarah first crossed my mind. It could have been that night Hannah showed me pictures of Sarah's journal. It could have been that night Preston Jarvis disappeared. It could have been during the hellish weeks that followed while we walked on eggshells around our own house, praying to any god that would listen to deliver us from this nightmare we had found ourselves in. For a while, nothing seemed real. Could Sarah, my Sarah, kill people? No way. Never. But she had. Pictures of her from school, smiling happily back at us from in front of a painted woodland background hung in the hallway. I would pass them seeing her bright eyes, and ask myself if I truly believed that little girl was capable of the atrocities we accused her of. It was simply not possible. But it was. The idea sat in the back of my head, festering like an infected boil for weeks until it suddenly burst, spreading its contents all over my mind. I hated myself for thinking it, or even allowing the thoughts to come into my mind so clearly as that, but I hated myself even more for failing to see another option. There was no psychologist, no corrections officer, and no court that could contain her. If Sarah wanted to be free to do what she wished, then it was just a matter of willing it so. Perhaps if there was a correct dosage of some drug we could give her that would dampen these abilities, then maybe we had a chance to reason with her. But if we got it wrong, it would cost the lives of everyone involved and countless others. Only way to ensure everyone's safety was to remove Sarah from the board altogether. She was too powerful and too psychotic to be able to live a happy, healthy life. She had always been a Scrooge on the neighborhood, no matter how much love we had shown her. And for 13 years we had proven time and time again that the rest of the world would shut her out, fear and hate her. Perhaps that fate would be best for her as well. I knew it wasn't true, but that was a lie I told myself to get myself to sleep. When I brought up the idea to Hannah, I think part of me wanted her to hate me for it. I wanted her to slap me across the face and tell me how awful I was for even suggesting such a thing. But she would give me no such satisfaction. I had taken her to dinner under the guise of wanting a romantic evening out of the house. After we'd ordered our entrees, however, Hannah called me out. "What is it?" she asked, a note of concern and dread in her voice. I frowned. "Don't give me that look," she said, a bit more harshly than I think she intended. "You got us out of the house so we could talk about Sarah, didn't you? Has something else happened?" No, I said, shaking my head. "Nothing like that." She took a sip of her water. "But it is something about Sarah, isn't it?" I collected myself for a minute, drinking about half my glass of ice water as I did so. Then I told Hannah my idea. My heart felt like it was about to beat right out of my chest and onto the plate of Alfredo I'd ordered. Hannah didn't speak for several long minutes. I tried to eat my meal, but at that moment, it seemed like the least appetizing thing in the world. When she did speak, her voice was low and quiet, and bubbling over with regret. "I think you're right." I wasn't sure if I was going to laugh or sob. The two balanced each other out, and instead I sat there stoically. "Did you hear me?" Hannah asked. Tears were welling in her eyes and the corners of her mouth were twitching downward. I nodded, still unable to speak. My throat was burning. We sat for hours in that restaurant, eventually found our stomachs after some time, and were able to put at least a little food down. It was there we began to hatch our plan. The first part of the plan was to get our neighbors on board. At least Bob from across the street and Tammy next door. They were the most likely of anyone to see or notice anything suspicious. We told ourselves that if either Bob or Tammy refused to help us, or at least collaborate with the story we would craft, then we would call the whole thing off. I rehearsed what I would say a dozen times before I found myself on Bob's front porch with a plate of cookies Hannah had made. Bob smiled when he opened the door and saw the cookies. When he met my eyes, his smile collapsed. "Come on in," he said. "You look like you got something to talk about." He let me in and around the room where he had two maroon recliners. The house smelled like roses. "Can I get you a drink?" Bob asked, but already he was shuffling to the kitchen. "Sure," I answered, knowing well that if I had declined his offer, Bob would still come out with 2 beers anyway. I heard the twinkling of glass and the familiar sound of the cap being removed. Then Bob came back around the corner. He handed me a bottle, then sat down in the adjacent recliner, sighing. "Now what's on your mind, son?" I tried to swallow, but my mouth was too dry. I took a sip of beer and began. "Sarah's not well," I said. Bob raised his eyebrow. "Is it the cancer?" "No, nothing like that," I said. "She's got something wrong with her mind. I'm sure you've noticed that she's different from the other children, and that she makes people feel, well, uncomfortable." Bob nodded. I swallowed another sip of beer. "Hannah and I have done what we can to help her, but things have gotten past the point where we can offer help, or anyone can offer help." I paused, searching Bob's face. What I was about to say next would condemn me. "You remember that day Bear got hit by the U-Haul? That was Sarah. She's able to do things like that, but also much more terrible things. I think that's why people feel the way they do when they're around her. They can sense that she's different, that she's dangerous. A few things have happened. I'd rather not get into the details, but I will if you need me to, that have brought Hannah and myself to the conclusion that..." Bob held up his hand. My stomach twisted around like a cold snake. "Did I ever tell you about my time in the service?" I shook my head, so taken aback by the sudden change in topic that I momentarily lost my voice. "I was stationed in Quezon in '68, and saw more bloodshed than any man should see in his life. Thousands of people died that year. Many nights I would fall asleep to the sounds of gunfire in the distance, and wake up to the sounds of men screaming. I can't say I didn't take lives. God help me, I took far more than I care to say. There were others." He trailed off, and for a moment I wondered if he would continue his story. When he spoke again, his voice was rough, and his eyes were misted by tears of the past. "I first met Paul when we were in boot camp together, and he was my only lasting friend throughout the entire nightmare. When the killing started, I didn't think I could be more terrified. But when I looked at Paul, I saw something that scared me even more than the thought of losing my life to the enemy. I could see pleasure in Paul's eyes every time he fired his weapon at another man. He enjoyed it. He loved it. He told stories of his exploits and his murders as if they were hunting tales. He'd talk about how many gorillas he killed as if they were nothing but a few low-point bucks. And with every word he spoke, his self-satisfaction grew. As the days became weeks and the weeks became months, that look in his eyes stayed. The stories he told became more horrendous. And the man that he once was seemed to be lost forever. I saw him open fire on men, women, and children, relishing every final breath he took for his own. I saw him commit atrocities that I'll never speak of. We got our transfer papers one night, and where most men would feel joy and excitement to finally leave the bloodshed, I felt horror for those that would cross paths with my once dear friend, for I had no doubt in my mind that the killing may have stopped for me, but for Paul it had only just begun. It was a game to him now, and he would continue to play. The last life I ever took was that of my best friend in the jungle of Vietnam, on the day before we were set to transfer. We had stumbled across a family of travelers along the road, and where I saw people, men, women, and children, Paul saw nothing but lambs for the slaughter. He brought up his rifle to his shoulder, and I shot him in the back of the head. I don't wonder if I did the right thing, but if I'd done the right thing sooner, how many innocent lives would have been saved? Bob held the bottle to his lips and finished his beer, then stood up and went to the kitchen for another. I love that little girl of yours. The note of pain that had developed in his voice now seemed to seep through the walls. I too want what's best for her. I won't hear the question you came here to ask. Such things are better left unsaid. But I think you'll find I've answered it nonetheless. Indeed he had.